This is the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack, engaging leaders from the pharma universe. Hello and welcome to the Pharmaverse podcast. I'm your host, Michael Pietrack. And if you're a leader or an aspiring leader in the pharmaceutical industry, you've come to the right place. Today's guest is Camille Pope, the Chief Medical Lead at Acclinate. Previously, she was the Prostate Cancer U.S. Medical Lead at AstraZeneca. But her passion and her expertise have called her to focus her career on increasing diversity in clinical research, a truly noble calling, because clinical research diversity is an important topic for all leaders throughout the pharma industry. So Camille Pope, welcome to the Pharmaverse.
Hello, thank you for having me, Michael. It's a pleasure to be here.
The pleasure's mine. And what I thought we should start off talking about is how you ended up at Acclinate focusing on diversity in clinical research. Talk to us a little bit about that.
Sure. So I am a pharmacist by profession, and I worked in traditional pharmaceutical industry for about 15 years. And my career has primarily been in medical affairs at various companies, whether it be headquarters or field-based as a medical science liaison. In my most immediate role before joining Acclinate was at AstraZeneca, as you said, as the U.S. medical strategy lead for prostate cancer. And I also worked on other tumor types as well. And what I found through the duration of my career is that I was constantly involved in therapeutic areas like HIV, hepatitis C, breast cancer, prostate cancer, which I knew in the real world disproportionately impacted in a negative way people that looked like me. I identify as a Black woman. When I worked in prostate cancer, I knew that, prostate cancer, advanced prostate cancer is twice as likely to be diagnosed in Black men and twice as likely to die from it. Yet when I would look at the data that I was being asked to communicate to key opinion leaders or clinicians or to review in my medical strategy and MSL roles, and I looked at those demographics of those studies, I didn't see that diversity represented. I didn't see people who looked like me or other underrepresented populations within this country represented in the clinical research. And so, I started thinking about how can we change that? It's really important for drugs and devices to be researched in everyone who wishes to be included in order to ensure that they are safe and efficacious in everyone. And so I ended up leaving my more traditional pharmaceutical industry career and joining a small company called Acclinate that focuses on this mission of clinical research, diversity, and making research more inclusive for the purpose of achieving health equity. And so we partner with pharmaceutical companies on their diversity plans, on their community engagement activities, and also measuring those activities to ensure that the work that they are doing and that we're partnering with them to do is impactful. And we're bringing research opportunities to people who have been historically excluded from the process.
Yeah, truly, like I said, a noble calling. And curious, we hear the acronym DE&I a lot. Mm-hmm. And we think of it as almost one term with one meaning, but the acronym has components to it. Can you break down the letters and tell us what it all means?
Sure. Yes. So yes, we hear DE&I and it's all like run together if this is one thing, this one entity, but it really isn't. And I think it's really helpful for us to think of the different components and what they really mean. So diversity really is just all the things that make us different and unique from one another. And that could be anything. It could be race, ethnicity, the way we think, our culture, our lived experiences, the different perspectives that we bring to the table. And that's what diversity encompasses. When we think about inclusion, that is the concept that even though we are different and diverse, we are, placed in an environment where we feel valued regardless of that diversity. And so our thoughts and our perspectives, our experiences, our cultures are all represented, and we feel valued in that environment, and we feel, for all intents and purposes, included. Equity means without thinking about health equity, because I'll talk about that in a second. But equity is really fair treatment for all. But it's not just like fair treatment for all. It's the actual removal of barriers or the the provision of resources to ensure that there is fair treatment for all. Meaning that if people aren't starting at the same level as others, then you may be providing additional resources or removing barriers so that they can gain access and receive that fair treatment, whatever that fair treatment might be. And then when we get to health equity, it's really like taking all of those different concepts and applying them to health and saying that everyone, regardless of who they are, what their background is, what their race, ethnicity, gender, or whatever, everyone has a right to be as healthy as possible. And that, whoever we are, whatever entity we might be, we are really genuine and purposeful about addressing disparities and removing barriers that keep that from happening, or providing resources that will allow that to happen. And so I think it brings brings the whole DE&I term to a different light when you think about the various definitions that are inclusive of that the acronym make up.
Yeah, that's really insightful. Thanks for breaking it down. And you brought up health equity. And so when we apply this health equity lens to clinical research, how does that impact the patients?
Sure. So, I like to think of the opportunity to participate in clinical research as just like one component of health equity, but it's a really important component. And, I guess because I've worked in the industry for a long time and it's all about clinical trials, it's one of the areas I focus on the most. And it's important to patients because it's just the right thing to do, right? It's the right thing to do for people. We know that clinical research often allows for the latest and cutting edge advancements to be received by people who are involved in clinical trials. And it helps to address health disparities and ensure that, again, drugs that are being brought to market have been researched in everyone. And there's a certainty or surety to an extent of safety and efficacy in all who are involved. And that's just, it's right to do for everyday people who are going to be using the drugs in the real world. Additionally, we know that while I'm always to say race is a social construct, but there are genetic differences and pharmacokinetic differences that can make it so that a drug works differently from one person to the next. And so it's important that as much as possible, we try to identify what those differences are when it comes to safety and efficacy during the research process, as opposed to a drug being on the market, having not been studied in everyone, and then not working in everyone the way it should after it's been prescribed to like millions of people, which has happened, right? So instead of it being an afterthought, trying to get it as right as possible during the drug development and research process. So that's why it's important to patients.
That makes sense. And I got to think, a lot of the people listening, everybody listening is either going to at one time be a patient or have a loved one that's a patient. And of course, we want to have all the latest data and all the right medicines given to those people and to us when we're the patient. But also a lot of the people listening are either pharmaceutical executives or within the pharmaceutical industry. How does using that health equity lens benefit the pharmaceutical company as well as the patient?
In many different ways. So again, it ensures that once your drug is brought to market, that it truly, to the best of the ability we're able to study it in the research process in different patient populations, that it's safe and efficacious in patient populations. I mean, and you would not want to be the pharmaceutical company that is out there with a drug that had positive phase 3 results, when the data were presented, and then you get to the real world population and there are major safety and efficacy signals because it wasn't studied in everyone. Additionally, there are now FDA guidances and legislation, I think we'll talk about this a little later on in the podcast, that are mandating that pharmaceutical companies think differently about how they have approached clinical research in the past, and to the best of their ability, ensure that they are including diverse patient populations. And so in that case, if the FDA is making, let's say, comments or requiring post-marketing commitments because you did not do that upfront during the clinical trial process, then that's additional, money that you as a company are now having to pay to do additional studies because you weren't inclusive in your patient when you thought about the patient populations in the development process upfront. And you certainly wouldn't want your drug to, not be approved or something like that to happen after you've spent lots and lots of money on like phase 3 clinical trial processes because you didn't include a representative population. So there's truly a business impact. And I even think about how you market a drug. Most of us working in the industry know that, you have to market to the label, right? And so if you are creating, let's say, marketing assets and putting on your marketing assets, people and populations that weren't actually studied in the clinical trial, you're really not supposed to be doing that. And that can cause pushback from regulatory authorities or internally from your promotional regulatory affairs teams. You might end up having to change your assets. I have experienced that in my career where, the marketing team had to spend thousands of dollars reworking their assets because who they wanted to market to and how they wanted to market the product didn't match the actual demographics of the patient population that was actually studied in the trial, even though the real world patient population was the more diverse patient population. So those are all things that we have to think about in connecting the dots as to how there could be a business impact when there isn't diversity and inclusion in clinical research.
Got it. So the health equity lens, good for patients, good for companies. And you talked about that it's an ever-changing environment with new regulatory guidances and new laws. Tell us what's been happening in that regard.
Oh man, a lot. So the FDA has been talking about this for a long time, and there have been a lot of guidances, I won't say a lot, but several guidances that have been released over the years from the FDA where they, provide recommendations about how to broaden eligibility criteria to be more inclusive and how to think about reworking study protocols to be more inclusive. In April of 2022, the FDA actually put out a draft guidance that was specific to racial and ethnic diversity, and it was a strong recommendation to pharmaceutical companies to create diversity plans prior to the start of pivotal trials, registrational trials, and submit those diversity plans to the FDA for review prior to the kickoff of the trials. And within those diversity plans, there were several different components that the FDA suggested be included, such as, the epidemiology of the disease, and are there certain patient populations in which the disease is, more prevalent, and how, as a company, are you going to think about addressing that and making sure that the clinical trial is run in those communities where that disease may be more prevalent? What sustained community engagement activities are you going to do? How are you going to measure the impact of those activities? And so the FDA put out a whole draft guidance about this. This is February 2024, so almost 2 years ago. And then towards the end of that same year, in December of 2022, there was legislation passed that basically put teeth behind that FDA guidance. So, the FDA provides guidance and it's a strong recommendation, but then Congress basically passed a law and said, we are giving the FDA, kind of the power to implement this. And so that's really when I saw many pharmaceutical companies beyond the ones who are already doing it before, but truly start to take notice and say, oh, this is no longer something that's nice to have. It's something that we have to do. We have to think about planning ahead when it comes to the diversity of our clinical trials and how we're going to engage patient populations that we haven't really had to worry about engaging before, or haven't really been held accountable to anyone for our lack of exclusion or our lack of inclusion before. Some other items that were in that legislation included recommendations that would allow the FDA to ask companies to put this information publicly on their FDA website, and for companies to speak to it on their own websites and say, what are the efforts that we're putting forth when it comes to increasing diversity on our clinical trials. There were a couple of FDA workshops that came out of that legislation because the legislation told the FDA, you have to get public input on how this actually gets implemented. And so there were some workshops at the end of last year, 2023, where the FDA allowed the public to speak about, what does this really look like when it gets implemented. And then that draft guidance that came out in April of 2022 was supposed to be updated at the end of 2023. It hasn't been updated yet, so I'm anxiously awaiting for the update. But those are some of the things that are going on from a regulatory and legal perspective that pharmaceutical companies who want to be a leader in this space really should be paying attention to, because it will dictate how the FDA reviews your submission packages for new data.
Wow, a lot going on there. It's got to be a full-time job just keeping up with that. That's incredible.
It is.
This episode is brought to you by K. Bassman International, the leader in pharma and biotech recruiting. When pharma executives need to make critical hires, they go to the experts at K. Bassman, pharma's one-source staffing solution. Visit kbic.com. Now back to the episode. When we spoke initially, sort of the pre-show intake call that we did, you used a couple words that, caught me a little off guard, to be frank. The word mistrust and exclusion from clinical trials. And you really educated me on that call. Can you kind of talk to our audience a little bit about those words, mistrust and exclusion?
Sure. So, gosh, how do I approach mistrust? It's really important for companies, again, who wish to be leaders in this space to really understand the communities that have been historically excluded or, just ignored when it's come to clinical research. And also understand if they haven't been historically excluded but have been hesitant to participate, why that's the case. And there are some really valid reasons around why, certain populations don't trust the healthcare system as a whole or mistrust clinical research. I mean, I identify as a Black woman, and I can, speak from my perspective as someone in the Black community. There are certain historical atrocities that have occurred, such as the Tuskegee experiment, where, the government, right, for 40 years, studied the natural course of syphilis in Black men, even after a drug, penicillin, was approved for syphilis, and they did not treat the Black men of syphilis. And this is something that is well known in my community, this situation and how it impacted those families for 40 years where the men just weren't treated. Or the situation of Henrietta Lacks, whose cell line was used. She was a Black woman who had cervical cancer, and she was treated at Johns Hopkins, and her cells were taken, without her consent. Now, it wasn't common back in those days in the 1950s to get consent from people, but her cell line was taken her cells were taken without consent and then cultivated and harvested over the years, and have been the backbone of many of the drugs and vaccines that have been developed even to this day. And her family is just now being compensated for that, right? And so these situations that are well known in specific communities have led to mistrust of the research system and misunderstanding of the process. Well, I don't want to say misunderstanding of the process, but even not necessarily understanding what are the things that came of that, right? So now we have informed consent. Now we have institutional review boards to ensure that, if you're going to do research on patients, that they are thought of first, and there are ethics considerations and there are safety considerations. But even with those things in place, there's, certain communities where the mistrust still is there because of the remembrance of those historical atrocities. So it's important for those who are doing research to understand and validate those things before just saying, okay, well, we're going to try and do research in your community now and think we're going to put a clinical trial in a Black neighborhood and all the people are going to come running and want to participate because now we're thinking of you. It takes more than that, right? You have to take the time to validate people's feelings, to understand why they do mistrust, to provide information that can help them make more informed decisions, and really give them that choice of whether or not they want to participate. And that takes time, and it takes a culture and a level of trust building.
That kind of goes back to your point about equity. Equity is not just giving the exact same thing, but it's eliminating barriers. It's maybe helping someone get to the point where it can even be equitable and where you have both offerings would apply to both people. So you're saying there needs to be an effort just to get certain communities back to the playing field everybody else is on.
Yes.
Got it. Okay. Like I said, that was really educational for me. And I'm sure mistrust is just one of several factors that has been impacting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Are there other factors too that we need to know about?
Oh yeah, there are a ton. I know I'm not going to be able to talk about all of them in this podcast. But one of the factors that I really like to bring to light are biases and assumptions that are often made about certain populations. And, an assumption that, okay, well, everybody's Black knows about Tuskegee doesn't want to be involved in clinical research anyway. Which isn't true, right? There are many people who would love to be involved in clinical research if given the opportunity. But if you make the assumption as a healthcare provider and never ask them or offer the opportunity to participate in research, well, you're excluding someone before they even have a chance to decide whether or not they want to participate. So there are inherent biases and assumptions that are often made about patient populations that we just have to be mindful of. And we have to, as research sponsors, as healthcare providers, as those of us who are really interested in being more inclusive when it comes to this process, we have to erase all of that and come with a clean slate. In my work now at Acclinate, we do a lot of community engagement. And part of that is allowing patients and community members to just share their stories about being maybe diagnosed with specific diseases. And because we have a focus on educating around clinical research and making sure people are making informed decisions as to whether or not they want to participate, we often ask people the question well, would you participate in clinical research if given the opportunity? And many Black folks, because we focus a lot on the Black community, are like, yes, I would. If I was ever offered a clinical trial, but no one's ever offered me one. Or, if I understood the process a little bit better, but I've tried to ask about the process and I've kind of been, my healthcare provider didn't really explain it in a way that would make me feel comfortable participating. And so, again, there's this misconception sometimes or this assumption that people don't want to participate. And that's not necessarily true. Or there are more people out there who have participated than you would know. And we talk to folks all the time and they're like, oh yeah, I'm in a study right now. And, super surprising. Their own family members don't even realize that maybe they're participating in a clinical research study or have had that experience. And so again, it's all about, just rethinking about how we engage people and assume whether or not they want to participate, how we provide education and resources for them to make an informed decision and then remove the barriers so that they can do so if they want to.
And you're giving us a lot to think about. This is a leadership podcast, and the people leading or listening are leaders in the pharmaceutical industry. So how can leaders at a pharmaceutical company better engage with communities who have been historically underrepresented in the trials?
Oh, there are lots of different ways that they can do this. It's all about just being genuine in your approach. So I think about my experience working in traditional pharmaceutical companies, and sometimes the approach when it comes to clinical trials is just enroll, get the numbers. Is the person eligible? Are they not eligible? If they're not, you're kind of okay, next, instead of really taking a genuine interest in the patients and their well-being. And creating, study protocols that would be more conducive to people being able to participate and investing in, again, and just caring about folks and helping to build that trust before you go in and ask them to do something that they might not be sure about in the first place. So I would say it's really about trust building. And, pharmaceutical companies aren't necessarily, I won't say they're not great at it, because they can be good at it, but maybe not always equipped to do that on their own. So you need to partner with the entities outside of your company that are good at doing that. That might be certain patient advocacy groups. It might be community groups that are literally in the communities where you are trying to run the clinical trials, and going there and talking to people and having a presence and investing in the community before you want to run the study. An example of this might be, usually as a pharmaceutical company, pretty far out about what your development program is kind of going to look like. You might know a year or two in advance that you're going to be running 3 or 4 breast cancer clinical trials. Well, before it's time to kick off the clinical trials, go into maybe a community where you haven't really run clinical trials before and get to know the people. Maybe do some free breast cancer screenings. Maybe start to understand who are the community influencers who can help raise awareness about the importance of breast cancer and the disease before you go in there and try to run a clinical trial. Do some education around clinical research and what it might look like if a clinical trial was placed in that community at a community clinic and not, the standard academic center that we tend to always have all of our clinical trials run at, right? Start to do those things early and partner with those who really know the lived experiences of the community that you're trying to reach, and really show a genuine invested interest in them. And then move on from there. So that's one of the main things that companies can do, is really just partner and invest in community and build trust ahead of time before you want something.
Yeah, those are some great ideas. Are there any other things that a pharmaceutical leader can do at their company internally to really set up a clinical trial that is perfectly set up for diversifying?
I don't know about perfectly set up, but you can certainly position yourself in a way that you're maybe more successful than you have been in the past. One of the things I love to say is that this is not just a clinical operations problem. Yes, your clinical operations team and your clinical development team, they're often responsible for, the clinical development team is writing the protocol. The clinical operations team is operationalizing everything around the clinical trial. So identifying the clinical trial sites and, getting the study kickoff and following what's going on with the PIs and all of the things. But lack of clinical trial diversity impacts the whole company. So really, you should be working together. And we know that there are firewalls in industry, right? But sometimes I feel like we allow what is perceived to be a firewall to be a hindrance to actually doing better as an organization. So for instance, when you're thinking about the patient funnel and the demographics of who the marketing team is going to be trying to reach once the drug is actually approved, the marketing team often has already done that work. They know who they're trying to market to, right? And so it would, in my opinion, behoove of the clinical development team or the clinical operations team, when you're trying to understand, incidence and prevalence of disease, to talk to your marketing team, your data scientists. A lot of times that work might have already been done preliminarily and help to inform your efforts when you're trying to identify where your clinical trial sites should be, right? There's more to it than just a clinical operations perspective. Because I worked in medical affairs for a long time and I was an MSL for many, many years. I know how well I knew my territory when I was an MSL, and I knew the ins and outs of the academic centers, the community clinics, the people who lived in the community. And I loved it when my clinical development and clinical operations teams valued my opinion enough to ask me about where should we be considering running certain clinical trials, what PIs that have we not worked with before might actually have the patient population that we're looking for, or maybe have the research infrastructure. Or if they don't have the research infrastructure, do you as an MSL have recommendations on how we can get them connected to an academic medical center that has the research infrastructure so that their patients can, get access to the clinical trial? And so if clinical operations and clinical development teams aren't talking to the MSLs, the medical affairs team, again, you're missing out on setting yourself up for success and getting the best recommendations possible when trying to run the study. Same thing with patient advocacy teams internally. everybody should be working together to try to achieve this goal. And so I would say that's one of the best things you can do to set yourself up for success, is to really think about how all of the different functional areas, like what are the different roles and bits of information that they have and the roles that they can play to help like drive the mission forward.
What a nugget. Those are great ideas. Wonderful ideas. We have time for one last question. It's more of a general question about leadership. And I try to ask everybody on the podcast this. What is your top tip for leaders that are listening to this podcast as far as either aspiring to become a leader or to lead a team or a department?
Oh, my top tip. I actually just gave a talk last week, and I was telling some PharmD, some industry fellows about just master your job. Like, be good at what you do. Whatever that might be at the time, but like strive for absolute excellence. Really know the ins and outs of that role. Yes, be thinking about what are the skills that you need to gain to like go to your next role, but don't always be so quick to try to jump to that next role without mastering the skill set that you need to master in your current role first. And also, if you prove yourself and you prove, again, not perfect, but you certainly want to strive for excellence. If you strive for excellence and really like become great in your current role, it opens the door for you to be able to do other things on top of that role while you're still in it, because people will be able to, translate your great work ethic, your knowledge, all of that to other opportunities without you maybe even having to switch and do something different. And I have found that has been super valuable in my career. There were, programs and things that I did above and beyond my day job when I was at AstraZeneca, and I know my AstraZeneca colleagues can vouch for this. I feel like the reason I was able to successfully gain leadership buy-in and, funding and the ability to do those things, which were around clinical trial diversity and workforce equity and starting scholarship programs and things like that, was because I was a good prostate cancer medical director. And so people knew that if I can execute well as a prostate cancer medical director, then I likely would do well trying to execute these other programs that I also thought were important to our business. And so it was all about just being the best that I could be in my current role, and that opening the door to other opportunities for me to excel as well. So I would give that recommendation to other current leaders, like, do your thing in your role.
Wonderful insights. And unfortunately, this is all the time we have for the episode, but Camille Pope is a great follow on LinkedIn. Feel free to connect with me as well. But that wraps up another episode of the Pharmaverse. Camille, for all here listening, I just want to thank you for your time and your insights. It was really educational, and Acclinate really has the right person in the right seat. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Michael. Bye, everybody.
Well, we have many more great leaders lined up for you. Still lots to come. Thanks for listening. See you next time in the Pharma. Thanks for joining us on the Pharmaverse podcast. Make sure you subscribe below so you don't miss any leadership insights. Like and comment. I would love to hear from you. We'll see you on the next episode of Pharmaverse.